Welcome everybody. My name is Cheryl Virant, and I am one of the co-founders of Cajal Academy. Uh, and I also am mom to two twice exceptional kids, as well as daughter to two twice exceptional parents and sister to a twice exceptional brother. You can literally say I've lived this issue all my life. I'm also a former corporate litigator, you know what everybody does right before launching a school. That my co-founder in creating Cajal Academy is Heather Edwards, who is a really expert occupational therapist with not only additional training and interest in things like sensory strategies and, or rather sensory integration therapy and a wide range of fine motor, gross motor, etc. But additionally, she has that all important curiosity and really compelling drive to understand not just, okay, what is a protocol one could use to resolve issue ABC, but how does it actually work? What is the neuroscience behind that? So what is happening neurochemically when we use different sensory strategies for different kids, etc. And that, as you will see, has turned into some pretty innovative new ways applying and leveraging neuroscientific research that's been out there for decades in the classroom. And that brings us to Dr. Stephen Mattis, who I know will be joining us as soon as his computer begins to cooperate for the day. Dr. Mattis is an internationally recognized neuropsychologist who has been recognized as one of the founding fathers of neuropsychology in the US. He has over 70 peer-reviewed journal articles to his name, and has done original research in a lot of areas that relate to the ways in which the actual neurology of a given human impacts their learning, social, and emotional experiences. And when we kind of kept coming back to him for guidance and advice as to, well, we figured out we have to do this and the science aligns there. So how do we do that? And about the fifth phone call like that, he said, why don't I help you guys? And then he joined into our team. So Dr. Mattis wears multiple hats. He's, in addition to being on our board, he's also our director of programs. And he additionally acts as our school psychologist. And he has several decades experience working with children and adults with a really wide range of differences and needs within a tremendously broad range of settings. He's also a professor, has been a professor at 3 of the world's leading medical schools. So he also, brings that expertise as well. We have an expert multidisciplinary team that's already in place. The majority of this team are folks that I had actually been handpicking over the course of about 5 years in looking for people who have really had a deep level of expertise and curiosity again, to understand truly complex children and how you can find the leverage and bring that out for kids. In addition to Dr. Mattis and Heather Edwards, we also have 2 licensed physical therapists, Liz Tynan, and then also Irene Boyle, who's not on the slide. We also have an art therapist who joined us this year. Our project-based learning program is actually run by Diane Schindler, who has a PhD in cultural anthropology and is also, which, sounded to me like a very esoteric degree until I heard her start teaching. And now I think it's like the most relevant degree for any teacher ever, because there's so many different ways. She's always drawing back to culture and to social change, social movements, social progress. And she's also got experience working with children all the way from 3rd grade through the college level as a writing instructor. So that's turned out to be very, very important for our program. Allison Best and Allison Margot, we're full up, can't hire any more Allisons. But Allison Best and Allison Margot are both certified Connecticut teachers. And we will be adding additional staff to our team as we head into the fall as well. Much of the origination of this school basically came from 2 places. So the first was that I drew the lucky card that I had 2 kids who have polar opposite profiles, and yet neither had really an appropriate educational setting in our community. With that in mind, I went to Heather Edwards and the rest of the team that we were very privileged to have and said, what do we do? And pretty quickly, we discovered two interesting things. Number one, that there's an awful lot of kids who find themselves in that position. And this is specifically true of kids who have very high cognitive profiles that are coupled with some area of difference. And then the second thing that we learned is that there's 20 or 30 years worth of neuroscience out there that is no longer controversial, but it hasn't really been turned into operational strategies that can be implemented in a classroom. And so we very quickly realized that there's a lot that makes it challenging to go through life about that combination that I mentioned of having the very high cognitive profile coupled with an area of difference. And we have this science that can help us to bridge those gaps and to help move those kids forward. And then we also have strategies that have been developed in therapeutic settings such as occupational therapy, psychotherapy settings, et cetera, for decades that can actually help us to get that job done. But again, we just don't have ways to operationalize that in a classroom. So we incorporated ourselves as a nonprofit in April of 2019 in order to work towards actually creating those new educational approaches and running a flagship 2E school. Now, why do both things? Well, quite simply, because we found that we needed the strategies in order to run the school we wanted to run, and we needed the school in order to develop the strategies. So we did something completely unheard of. We said, experts, you get to design the school. We took the folks who usually get arranged around the outside of an educational environment in related services silos, and we stuck them at the center of the room. And we did that for a very simple reason. Those folks, your OTs, PTs, psychologists, neuropsychologists, they are the experts in how children learn, socialize, develop, and grow. So we wanted to have their expertise at, like I said, at the center of the room, helping us to figure out everything from what the school looks like to how the kids communicate within the school, how the school days function, how the academic program is structured, et cetera, et cetera. So what does this mean for the high school program? I know some of the folks who are here with us today or who might be watching this on YouTube after we post it have already seen our more general open house or some of our educational workshops and might be interested to know, so how's this going to look different for kids at the high school level? Right now, what we're putting together is a very select group of kids who will be really part of our kickoff of our high school program in full when we reopen in person in the fall. Yes, I did say in person. We are actually right now in conversations with a number of different locations around the facilities around the community that will give us the opportunity to open in person with really a very new and different kind of facility. So we're hoping to be able to make an announcement about that soon. Within this this cohort that we're putting together, we will for the fall be looking to bring together a total of probably a maximum of 12 kids. And this is a mixed age cohort by design. Now, within that mixed age cohort, we are looking to have 4 to 6 kids who are in the high school range. Over the course of next year, we expect that we will be growing the cohort through mid-year placements. But the reason we're going to start small, again, by design, is because we want to make sure that these innovational new approaches that we've developed are properly embedded in culture and are ready to scale before we try to just, throw kids at it, as they say. We are very mindful, both as entrepreneurs and as clinicians, that with respect to the rest of the team, that we don't want to scale too quickly because that will not be good for the kids. So within this, the kids who are joining our high school program are going to have very unique opportunities. So the first piece of this is we're looking for kids who have very strong analytical and creative reasoning skills and who are really seeking a greater level of intellectual stimulation and inquiry-based learning than what they're currently getting in other environments. One of the things that I found as mom when I went out looking in the community is that it seemed that I could find placements where my kids' needs for intellectual stimulation would be well met, but where I did not see the kind of support that they needed with respect to their areas of difference, or vice versa. But I wasn't finding environments where the two were being brought together. So our entire program is brought specifically to bring those two components together. Um, we are looking for kids who would benefit from being within a tight knit, smaller environment, since that's where we're going to be in the fall, and with who are really there. There's pros and cons to everything. The upside to being in a very tight knit, small, nurturing environment, number one, they are going to have a tremendous amount of direct access and input with our founding team of academic and therapeutic visionaries. And in addition to that, they are going to have the opportunity to really help set this culture. The high school group will be receiving programming separately, as one would expect, for their academic instruction, et cetera, et cetera. However, there will be opportunities to participate in the larger community in ways that can really help kids who maybe have felt that their needs were being overlooked in other environments. We find that kids who have a twice exceptional profile tend to get along more comfortably with kids who are older than themselves or younger than themselves, but they might struggle with some of their same age peers in terms of relating with them, etc. And so this allows the opportunity to have natural kinships while we work to build up those skills. Also, kids who are in our high school program will have opportunities as we go along to take, for instance, with respect to assessments. Maybe instead of taking a test, they will be tasked with teaching some content that they've learned to some of the younger kids in the program. So some kids might prefer to sit down and take a test, but I suspect that many will enjoy the option to instead have an opportunity to try their hand as teachers. And in the process, that will help to work on social anxieties, performance anxieties, communication skills, executive function skills, etc. So I am happy to say that Dr. Mattis has been able to join us now. In terms of understanding the kids that Cajal Academy serves as a whole, twice exceptional kids. So what does that term even mean? I have to say, we actually aren't real fond on that term ourselves, because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and it's both over and under inclusive. So generally speaking, the folks that are the kids that we are looking to serve at Cajal are kids who, as I said, have very high fluid reasoning, verbal reasoning skills, analytical skills. These are creative thinkers who think out of the box, and typically speaking, that is paired with some area of challenge. And that might be something like executive function, social skills, complex medical profiles, social emotional differences. What these kids have in common is that they are traveling through life with a very disparate and asynchronous profile in a world that presumes that we develop evenly across the board. That's just not true. It's just counterfactual for these kids. So this can lead to a number of different challenges. So first and foremost, typically speaking, their gifts hide their challenges and their challenges hide their gifts. So as these kids have been traveling through from early childhood all the way up to high school, it's very common that they get along for a certain amount of time on their own innate intelligence and their own high analytical reasoning skills. And that can lead to some challenges that start to boil up under the hood and get to a place where those then become problematic to a point where hopefully we don't end up in a train wreck, but we may end up in that state of, I just don't see how to go forward from here, or I see how to go forward, but not to where I ever thought I would be, only to something that feels like it's safe for me. So these kids, you have to understand, this experience typically starts all the way back in early childhood as they're just beginning to be able to verbalize and vocalize and advocate for themselves. So the example that I like to use is little Johnny. He's sitting in his preschool class, and they hand out a worksheet, and the worksheet has outlines of trees. And the teacher says that that each child should color the trees in a realistic color. And everybody else picks up the green crayon and the round crayon, and Johnny grabs the pink one, and he colors his tree. And the teacher says, "Why don't you ever follow the rules? I gave you very clear instructions. Everybody else understood. They colored green and brown. Why is your tree pink?" Well, Johnny was thinking about his favorite cherry tree when it's in bloom, but he doesn't know enough about the difference between how he interprets the world and experiences the world and how everybody else does to realize, oh, I've actually just had a more creative interpretation of these directions, and I should advocate for myself. Instead, he walks away saying, whoa, suddenly this feels like a less safe environment. I did my best, and I got yelled at. I got in trouble, and I don't know why. Plus, I stick out relative to all the kids around me. And when you put that together, very quickly, these kids can start to fall into these three horribly bright red boxes across the middle of my slide. I'm bad, I'm stupid, and I don't fit. Those are very, very dangerous ideas for a child to walk away with. And they themselves can become impediments to the child being able to take on and succeed at future learning experiences. Most of the families who contact us tell us that they relate to those lists that you might see on websites about twice exceptional kids, where they talk about 2E kids' characteristics. And they usually talk about things like avoids non-preferred tasks or refuses to do things that don't interest them. Maybe this is sounding familiar. We look at that differently. We look at that as hypervigilance to failure. So nobody enjoys repeatedly trying something and feeling unsuccessful. And the fact that you have some significant areas of outlying strength coupled with some areas where you have more challenge, it's very difficult to predict what's going to be hard and what's not. Most kids are not taught to understand their own neuropsychological profiles. They are at Cajal, but they aren't in most schools. Most teachers aren't taught how to differentiate instruction based on specific neurocognitive skills. Again, we do that at Cajal too. What this means is that these kids are constantly, it's like walking into a buzzsaw. So being very intelligent humans, they protect themselves. And so that's where we end up with this high propensity among kids who have these very asynchronous profiles to end up being resistant to things that are not in their interest area, etc. So before I tell you about how we propose to solve this problem, I thought I should take a step back and tell you about the process that we use at Cajal Academy for solving every problem. Essentially, we are broken records, or at least I am. It's my job in the team. We are at every step in the process. We use an iterative three-step process to figure out how we can help move kids forward. So step one is to figure out, what problem am I trying to solve? Step two is to figure out how can we move the needle for that problem? And then step three is how can we give kids agency over this process? So we turned that process on ourselves and said, okay, if we're going to design a high school program, what problem are we trying to solve? So here's concretely the issue. You may notice there's some boxes in the back of this slide. I'm the mom of a teenager whom I hope will, in the not too distant future, leave my home, go out into the world, and become independent. When that happens, I want him, as a very complex, bright, and creative thinker, to have a toolbox that he can use to actually independently chart his own course through a world very different from the one that I graduated into. A post-Google world in which we can look up facts and figures we don't know, but we need to know how to work with those facts. We have opportunities to create things that were never even contemplated previously. And I'm not coming along. When he goes to college, I do not plan to go. So he needs to have a toolbox that will allow him to independently go out into the world on his own and feel empowered to be able to chart his own course. So that is sort of the the mantra or the mission behind our whole high school program. It's really focused on giving our teens the independence that they need, um, as well as the tools that they need to be able to manage their own needs, seek out big problems, and go solve them. Look how big the problems are that our kids are going to have the opportunity to solve. It is definitely a changed world, but one in which, I use this phrase opportunities to solve very carefully, because that's exciting, right? For really bright, creative thinkers who have high analytical skills, this is like mind candy to solve big, hard problems. And it's overwhelming. And we need a process to learn how to do that. So if we kind of reverse engineer from there, if we're going to solve these big problems, then our teens are going to need to have the ability to process massive amounts of information, to collaborate with people who are all over the world, and to think flexibly and constantly be testing their assumptions. To do that is going to require some foundational skills. They're going to have to know how to optimize their own thoughts, how to sustainably care for their own bodies, which, as we all know, just thinking about how, for instance, Google, how their offices have sit-stand desks and exercise equipment built in, because the knowledge economy is actually very demanding on us as humans. And they also have to know how to access their own creative minds. So if we're going to pull that off for kids who are not only super, super bright, but also have areas of difference that stand in their way, then we're going to have to start breaking down those barriers that stand in their way. And as we go through today, you'll see some of the kinds of barriers that we're referring to and how we go about addressing them. Some we've already alluded to. Having these big gaps between your strengths and your weaknesses, that alone creates a challenge. So there are three major components to our program, and this gets integrated, as you'll see, into a project-based learning framework. So we have standards-based academics. Let me emphasize that, standards-based academics. So we start with the Connecticut academic standards and next generation science standards. And we start with saying, for this child, what is their appropriate next step skill? Bearing in mind that some of these kids may be 2 grade levels ahead in reading, 2 grade levels behind in math, or the flip. So we're not looking to say, oh, look, you already happen to have met the 10th grade standards, so no math this year. No, it doesn't work that way. So what is the next step that they are going to be learning towards? The second major component is personal growth, and that comes through embedded therapies and expertise, and some very unique approaches to that by applying modern neuroscience, as we'll discuss as we go through. And then the third component is agency. And this, to me, is perhaps the most important piece. When I went looking at special education schools in the area, this was the piece that I felt I was most missing as I looked at the program options, is to have a focus on not just teaching to the way that your child learns, for instance, but giving your child the understanding, the intellectual understanding that they need to take charge of these tools for themselves. So we'll share how it is that we go about that as well. So starting with the academics, these are not just, academics writ large. This is academics specifically tailored to stimulate and empower students who walk in the door with very high analytical skills. Many of these kids are facing challenges at the high school years, specifically because their analytical reasoning skills were so high when they were younger that they just never had to learn how to study, or they never had to learn how to organize and outline. Now they're hitting curriculum that does demand more than what they can do through their own innate abilities, and that's where you start to see the real challenges. We need to address and solve those challenges before it becomes an impediment in college and in limiting their future opportunities as professionals. As we think about, or as we sat down to design what this academic program would look like, we started from one very important philosophical idea, which is that the kids that we are looking to bring into our program are ones who, yes, have phenomenal potential as future professionals, but why stop there? If you come into this world differently wired on 2 different axes, both outlying strengths and meaningful differences from the other kids around you, you are going to develop perspectives on this world that are simply different. When we are kids, we look at that as, oh, he doesn't fit. When we are adults, we look at that as innovation. So what we are designing is an academic program that is specifically intended to help develop the skills that you need to not to try to fit in with your unusual ways of seeing the world, but to pick those up, develop them, and carry them forward as future thought leaders. Just like twice exceptional thinkers before, such as Santiago Ramon y Cajal, the neuroscientist that our school is named after, Steven Spielberg, Agatha Christie, Albert Einstein, some of the greatest leaders in our mathematics, science, academics, arts, and culture have been in that position specifically because of the uniqueness of their perspectives. So we don't want to hide those things. So going back to what we said before, we've got some skills that we're going to need to have in order to be able to solve these big problems or take these innovative ideas and turn them into thought leadership. So being able to organize large amounts of information, being able to communicate with others and collaboratively problem solve, and being able to think flexibly and with very high critical thinking. Will not surprise you to hear that that is one of the design principles behind, or the primary design principles behind our academic programming. So to go about this, rather than using a traditional academic content framework, we are using multidisciplinary project-based learning. Now, this is a framework that has been developed by the Bucks Institute and others for decades. And it is already, there are schools all across the country that are both mainstream and special education schools that are using this framework. So project-based learning starts with a real world problem. And here we can think of our saguaro cactus here from any number of problems, right? It could relate to environmental change, it could relate to immigration policy, etc. So you start with a real world problem, and then the kids work together to identify, what do we need to know in order to answer that problem? And then they together determine, so how can I get that information? Are there experiments that I can run? Is there research that I can do? Is there an expert that I can talk to? The role of the educator is to help give access and facilitation to getting that information, and also to be constantly asking questions to probe the children's thinking, to help them to delve deeper, think deeper into the problem, and as well as into their solutions as they develop them. So the next step is they have to work together as a team to develop a solution. You may be starting to see here how this framework is directly correlated to identified are going to be critical to being able to go forward as these independent thinkers in post-Google world, where we are not rewarded for being able to remember facts and figures, but being able to work with them and make something of them. How can we test our solution to make sure that it works? How can we improve upon our solution and iterate? And then ultimately, how can we communicate the solution to others? Now, as I went through that process, you will be forgiven if you're thinking to yourself, that takes a lot of executive function skills, and I'm not sure that my teenager has them just yet. That, my friends, is the point. We wanted to use an academic framework that acts as a natural laboratory within which to develop the skills that we think are most essential to 21st century success, and specifically for this group of kids. Many of these children struggle, as I mentioned before, with social skills. So having a collaborative framework means that we've created that natural laboratory within which to work on social skills. And actually, in our summer program last summer, Dr. Mattis co-taught our project-based learning studio so that he was right there on hand to support students not only with the social skills components to help them develop the ability to really collaborate with their peers, but also to help with executive function challenges as they were arising. And this is an example of how we integrate together both our academic instruction with our appreciation of the specific therapeutic goals that we have in mind for each child. And I'll tell you about how those goals get developed. So as we're choosing the specific problems and projects that we are going to work on for a given year. Now, these are long arc projects. We're currently working on a project, which I'll share in a moment, that will go on for the remainder of this school year, I expect. The projects, it's not, oh, what a cool project. What could we teach? We start the other way around. We start with those three main curricular components that I mentioned before: the standards-based academics, personalized growth goals, and then our agency curriculum. And we say, okay, what are the specific standards that need to be taught as the appropriate next steps for these kids? And then what real world problem can they work on that will integrate those standards and become an appropriate delivery mechanism, essentially, for us to provide that curriculum? So these project elements, you'll see, it's a broad arc project that has within it multiple different components that weave together as a theme across what is really a very traditional looking school day. So the kids are going to content skills classes, core skills classes that align to Connecticut high school graduation requirements for the public school environment. So we, as an independent school, we are not beholden to those graduation requirements, but we think there's a lot of value in going to those same core skills classes. Within those core skills classes, though, they are working to and gaining this same content within the project-based learning in pursuit of solving this real world problem. So why? Why do it that way? Well, tell me if you've heard this one. Mom, why do I need to learn this stuff? When am I ever going to use this? If that phrase has ever been uttered in your household, then you know why we're doing it this way. This immediately provides a real world purposeful learning context for the kids. And that alone makes it more interesting and exciting to engage, and also immediately lends itself to greater depth of exploration. Because if we're not just memorizing to learn how to take a test, but rather we're trying to solve a real world problem, then there are infinite depths of knowledge that become interesting and available. And we will actually bring in outside industry experts to provide mentorship or instruction, so that if there is a student who has a specific area of interest or talent, that there is no ceiling to them being able to pursue that, which is particularly important, I think, at the high school level. So to give you an example of what all of this looks like in the day-to-day, here's the project that we're currently working on. We're actually working on understanding how you can make a sci-fi movie really realistic, or how you can make a really bad sci-fi movie instead. As part of this project, the kids are developing alien creatures that have a realistic chance of surviving in an Earth-like biome. In the process of doing that, they are learning a great deal about environmental science and Earth-like biomes. They're also learning about genetics, about animal adaptations, about the biomechanics of how different creatures move. For the children in the program, they all have PT and OT goals that relate to their own biomechanics. So learning that content in the form of an academic piece of information that you're then going to creatively apply in creating this creature, that has that is less sort of less weighted, if you will, than learning it in a purely therapeutic setting. The kids are learning about screenwriting and about what they're reading, books that were then sci-fi books that were turned into sci-fi movies, and then we'll be writing comparison papers. Every child going through school has to write some number of critiques and comparison papers. This is again an example of how it gets directly integrated into the project-based learning by having that comparison be written about the topic of the learning project itself. They're actually going to be using math to animate their creatures through curriculum that was created by Pixar in a Box together with Khan Academy, which we've integrated into this project, and even composing parts of a screen score to convey different movie moods, etc. So as you can see, in the course of doing this project, which has a certain appeal to it, they're actually getting an awful lot of different academic and therapeutic strategies and content rather, and skills integrated together. So there's a lot of STEM content in this project, also language arts content and arts content, in addition to great deal of work around self-awareness, both on the physiological side, but also on the social emotional side and talking about experiences of feeling alien within an environment, and also just even thinking about how the experience of COVID has changed all of our understandings of our environment and how hospitable our environment may or may not be for us as well. So that just gives you one example of how the project-based learning framework, how we're using it to bring all of these elements together. So with that, let's turn to the second big component, which is personal growth or personalized growth. So one thing that you'll see is that every aspect of our programming is highly individualized for the needs of each individual student. So what we mean when we refer to personalized growth, and you can read more about this on our website, is really increasing the child's capacity to meet the challenges before them. And we do this through a combination of different items, which again come from more recent neuroscientific research that we have not seen implemented in the classroom elsewhere, including neuroplasticity and coaching in self-regulation strategies, utilizing the connections between your physiology and your learning social and emotional experiences, in addition to embedded executive function coaching. So let's go through those a little bit. Before I do, though, I want to sort of paint the picture of what does it look like for our kids to try to access something like the project-based learning framework that we just laid out there. Because I'm guessing that there are some folks in the audience right now who are thinking to themselves, "Ooh, that's pie in the sky. Don't see how that's going to happen." We all need to have challenge to inspire us. But one of the things that I am utterly convinced of, given my own experiences and as a mom, as a daughter, as a sister, and as myself, is that for kids who have very high intellectual capacity, you are never going to get to happy, healthy, and whole until you give them the opportunity to take that Ferrari engine that might be sitting under a Ford hood in the garage out for a test drive. They need to have the opportunity to understand just what they can do. They have to experience their own superpowers. But the problem is that they tend to feel like they're sitting on the side of the highway and it is whizzing by at a mile a minute and they just don't see the on-ramps. And for some kids, that's about feeling overwhelmed. For some kids, that's about a learning disability. For some kids, that's about a social emotional challenge. But in any event, what they feel like is there is this 6-foot Jersey barrier between me and the highway, and I am too smart to run headlong into that thing. So if we're going to help these kids get out there taking those risks that are required in order to learn and to grow, we're going to have to give them both the space, the tools, and a compelling reason to unlock their gifts. So we talked about the compelling reason. I think the project-based learning framework provides that nicely. But how can we actually identify and reduce the barriers that are standing in their way? So remember I said that everything we do at Cajal starts with this 3-step process, right? What problem does the child need our help to solve? How can we move the needle for that problem? And how can we give the child agency over this process? This is a highly specific and data-driven process because if we don't get very granular in our understanding of what problem we're trying to solve, we're almost guaranteed to get to the wrong solution. So with that, since we were able to make the link work for him, I want to turn this over to my colleague, Dr. Mattis, who, as I said, is a neuropsychologist, to explain about what does it really mean, or on what level do we figure out what problem we're trying to solve, and why is it important that we get beyond the labels in doing that process?
One of the issues that we face is that what we are observing primarily is behavior. And we have to be careful not to make judgments about what it is that is the etiology of that behavior. Most of the time, what we find is that the actual behavior is downstream, and it could be caused by multiple different etiologic factors, so that the diagnosis that the child has is sometimes a handicap if we use that diagnosis to figure out what it is that we think the child's problem is. in the looking at a child who has attention difficulty, is fidgety, is out of his seat. We have a child who could have ADHD, but most of the time, what we're looking at are children who have some specific ideologic factors that we really have to dig for. And frankly, even the term ADHD, really we have to dig for, because the way in which this diagnosis is obtained is to watch the child get a history, but diagnosis is made of a checklist, so that if the child has 4 of 6A and 4 of 6B, then we can call him ADHD. The problem with that is there's another kid who also is now called ADHD who has a different 4 and a different 4. And so we have a diagnosis or classification which we really can't use as a basis for what it is that the child is presenting at this point. So we have children with language disorders, children with dysregulation of emotion, some thought difficulties, and we do have trouble with the attentional system in some of these kids. But a lot of the time, whether it's ideologically caused, there is also a ancillary anxiety and mood difficulty that occurs whenever the child has difficulty obtaining a goal, especially when that failure is observed by other people and is a humiliating experience.
What Dr. Mattis helped me to appreciate is that the reason it's so important that you do dig, as he put it, to get beyond these labels is because you're obviously going to solve a language disorder very differently than you're going to solve a challenge with an attentional system. So when families call me, I've been stunned by the percentage who tell me that their child has been diagnosed with ADHD. And they'll say, so what's your ADHD program? What do you do for kids with ADHD? And my answer is that we start by figuring out what is meant by ADHD in this child's case, what is happening under the hood that led, or behind the scenes, that led to that presentation, and then we program according to that problem. So with that, Dr. Mattis, if you can explain the profile process that we use to start to try to get to understanding some of those distinctions.
Most of the time, by the time we see a child, the parents come in with a loose leaf book full of past reports. And those reports are actually very helpful to us. We have an opportunity to look at what the neuropsychological factors are, the social emotional, the sensory, and we're able to derive a profile in which we can pinpoint the child's strengths and weaknesses in a way that allows us to find those particular weaknesses, which, if we can deal with them, will lead to tremendous amount of growth in other areas. A rather significant one across the children that we see is the tremendous attention to failure, to the possibility of failure. You can imagine a child with verbal abilities that are outstanding and spatial abilities that are moderate, who is now given a task to solve. He doesn't know, or she doesn't know, whether or not that task is best solved with his analytic verbal skills, or is he going to have to depend on his spatial skills for this? He is therefore unprepared for the possibility of failure. And there's a couple of things that that person can do. Most of the time, they avoid it like the plague. They try to avoid any situation in which they are not 110% sure that they are going to succeed. And an individual learns what their strengths and weaknesses are within the neuropsych, but also in the social and the sensory processing, then they're able to predict with greater accuracy whether or not they can solve this problem. That doesn't mean they don't try to solve it if it's difficult, but they know beforehand that this is going to be difficult for them, and they're not blindsided by their assumption that this is a piece of cake because I think I can use all my analytic skills. Our children at this point are unaware of their strengths and weaknesses as it applies to cognitive and critical thinking, and how they can use this skill to deal with the outcomes and without a sense of failure.
The first step that we look to, though, is to figure out what are the domino ones. So these are those cross-cutting skills that are, reading is a cross-cutting skill, but really what we mean by that is these are the cross-cutting neurocognitive skills or neurophysiological skills that are going to be impacting a child in a wide range of settings, and that if we address those skills, it will therefore have a follow-along impact in a variety of different areas. So I call those the domino ones, because if you think about it, if you think of a domino maze and you have this whole chain of dominoes and they're all set up together, when there's one domino that when you push it down, it's going to go out in all these different directions, and you're going to see all these different manifestations of it across these different areas. So what we find is that when you address the domino one, then you start to see, as I said, these positive follow-on effects in other areas. So to give an example, one domino one might be working memory challenges. Working memory might impact in all these different areas, which would then therefore be benefited both in terms of performance and in terms of reducing the child's frustrations by working specifically to address that working memory need.
Okay. Working memory is holding a thought just long enough to act on it. It doesn't necessarily go into long-term storage, but you have to have an ongoing assessment of what just happened before, so you know what is going to happen next.
If we are able to figure out ways that we can actually build up someone's working memory, and this is again just by way of example, then there's going to be a whole bunch of different follow-on academic areas and social areas even where we call on our working memory that are then going to start to improve, like reading comprehension, like math facts, math calculations. So that's where there's leverage to be gained. Okay, but how do you actually do that, right? How do you actually increase someone's ability to do those low-lying skills that may be part of what's holding them back? So that brings us to the second step of our sort of meta process here of how first figure out what problem this child needs our help to solve. We narrow in on those domino ones. Now, how are we going to go after the domino one? What can we do to move the needle? So the short answer is that you have to work both sides of this equation at once. So if you think back to what I call my depressing slide that we had early on, there are, I'm stupid, I can't, I'm bad, or I'm going to get hurt. Those really become, as I said, in and of themselves, like learning disabilities in a way, because they impede your ability to corral your resources and actually make a new effort at something and to learn something. Simultaneously, though, we do want to increase up the capacity with respect to whatever the barrier may be. So let's walk through a little bit how we go about that. The most important thing to keep in mind is every piece of this is going to be different for each child. It's all highly individualized, again, based on that profile process that we talked about earlier. So starting with building up the low-lying skills. So as I mentioned before, all this tremendous change in neuroscience, which has happened as a result of the development of the functional MRI machine, and now actually being able to look at kids' brains as they do different tasks and understand how they are getting that job done. I'm not going to talk through all of these different areas today. Folks who have sat through our broader open house program for the program as a whole have seen more in some of these other areas. But for right now, I want to focus in on neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is this just real sea change in understanding that says that your capacity is not to do a given skill is not actually locked in at the end of early childhood. Because in fact, the brain is constantly rewiring itself as we call upon it to do new tasks. Now, this is one of my favorite videos, and I'm not going to show it to you because we don't have a lot of time today. But if you go to our brand new YouTube channel, here's my plug, you will find that this video is posted there. It's just a couple minutes long, and it really gives you a very visual and visceral understanding of how it works to literally carve out new pathways through the brain. Either way, this has some very big implications, right? So the first is that what we can do today doesn't have to limit who we can be tomorrow. And then the second is that we can drive this process to unlock our gifts if we start with figuring out what problem we're trying to solve, right? What is that Domino One strength that we want or weakness that we want to build up? And then go about creating tasks that require the brain to constantly use that process. So let's get a little bit more information about this, what we're talking about here. So when we think about success in school, we think about science, social studies, math. Okay, oh, he's really strong in reading, or he's not so strong in math. But what we don't think about is the other part of this axis, right? That there's these very specific neurocognitive and neurophysiological skills that cross-cut literally everything we do, not just every academic area, but they cross-cut the process of talking to our children or making dinner or going for a walk. So if we understand if we sort of take a step back from thinking about curriculum development as being, oh, well, first we learn about character development and then we'll learn about story arc, and thinking of it as cumulative in that way, what if we instead take a step back and say each of these tasks that we ask someone to do is really a bundle of a composite bundle of individual neurocognitive and neurophysiological skills? Well, now we can look at that a little bit differently, because when we go back to that profile process and we might have somebody who is 98th percentile with respect to their let's say their working memory, but let's say they're really, really challenged by how to structure information. So if we're asking them to do a task that requires you to structure information and hold it in your working memory, it's very easy from the outside to say, oh, he's super, super bright, he's going to have this, no problem. But if I am asking him to do at the 98th percentile level, something that someone we can see from the data is at closer to a third percentile today, we're going to make them frustrated. We're going to make them feel unsuccessful. If on the other hand, we dumb everything down to the third percentile, then they're going to be bored out of their minds with respect to the part where they're really functioning at the 98th percentile. So this gives an example of how, as we said before, traveling through a world that counterfactually presumes that you have synchronous development can be very, very frustrating and challenging for kids for whom in reality they have very asynchronous development. So what we need to do is we need to rethink how we differentiate to be aligning to those axes. We've got the data. We take it upon ourselves at Cajal to understand as the grown-ups' jobs to understand where those strengths and weaknesses lie and how to adjust our task demands to be able to tailor each task as close as we can to those areas where they have those strengths and their current level with respect to the areas of weakness. So you can see at the beginning, my sort of box number one here, you have to identify what are the cross-cutting neurocognitive skill that we're currently targeting. Oh, and by the way, what are the neurocognitive skills that are being called upon to do a given demand, whether it's writing an essay or learning calculus. The second boxes here is we're going to tailor the task demand to the current ability with respect to those neurocognitive skills while we employ the principles of neuroplasticity to really target and bring up that interfering low-lying weakness. And then low-lying skill. And then the third step is teaching the child the science behind all of this. So to pull this off, we really embed expert therapies and to build both neurocognitive and neurophysio growth directly into our classroom environments. So one of the things that people ask me during the admissions process is, in my child's IEP, he has 2 half-hour sessions of OT. Will he still get 2 half-hour sessions of OT? And my answer is, your child will be in an environment that was developed and designed by an OT, where OT principles will be infused into all portions of his instruction, and where the needs are so unique that it's necessary to do additional one-to-one OT work, then that will be integrated into the school day as well. Now, why did I phrase it in that way? Are we trying to get out of doing directed services? No, quite the opposite. We're trying to help these kids assimilate the information within the context where they need them. So, you're not going to have a sensory challenge at 2:30 p.m. on Tuesdays because that's when the OT is available. You're going to have it all day, every day, everywhere you go. You don't have an executive function challenge on the days that the executive function coach is in the building. You have it every time you try to do any academic task. So thus, we embed that kind of expertise directly into the instruction and the environment. Part of how we do this is that every week, all members of our team meet, all academics with all therapists as well, to discuss each child, the dynamics happening between the children, and then also what's coming up in the curriculum, and really to get a good sense of where are we. For instance, we have something coming up that's going to specifically challenge the ability to really organize a lot of information. Maybe that's a good day for Dr. Mattis to wander by just at 11 o'clock and poke his head in and give some strategies to the kids. Or if we're going to be winning our project design as a team, we're looking for opportunities, for instance, to integrate fine motor work as well. And the OT will show up on those days and will be part of those classes. So for instance, with our sci-fi movie program that we're working on right now, our sci-fi movie project, the kids are going to be actually creating in artistic media their creature, in addition to creating it as an animated digital creature. So that includes a lot of fine motor and sensory work with respect to sculpting the creatures versus painting the creatures, etc. So that we integrate, again, all of these different strategies through the academic framework. I'm not going to go into this in depth right now, but I know one of the areas that really becomes a roadblock for a lot of teens as they hit the high school curriculum is with respect to writing, because now we're looking to not only be coming up with creative thought, but really simultaneously to be doing research, which requires a lot of analytical thought, and organizing that information, coming up with a new thesis, deciding how to convey that and structure that in a written piece as well. Simultaneously, you have graphomotor components, whether you are typing or you are handwriting. Simultaneously, you're trying to pull things out of spelling rules, out of free recall. You're trying to get them into working memory and then apply them formulaically. There's a lot going on in these moments. So the way that we approach supporting a child who does have struggles in the area of writing in particular, for instance, although I could give you this example for reading or math as well, is really by, again, unbundling those skills. So it's not just, we'll let that child who has a graphomotor challenge use talk to text as an accommodation, but rather appreciating that what we're doing is we're taking back resources that right now are otherwise being allocated to the graphomotor challenge. We're gaining access to that resource base within the brain again that they can then use for analytical thought, and coupling that with the therapeutic work on the OT side to be building up the connections that are necessary to be able to improve the graphomotor piece. So how do we actually build up those connections? This is a video of my younger child, actually, in one of the areas when we first started to really apply this process to identifying our domino ones and then saying, okay, well, what can we do to literally build up new neural networks through the brain? How do we do this? So in this instance, he had been struggling in reading. He had a couple of different discrete struggles with reading, and we had kind of narrowed all those down to where he was, at this point, he was just really challenged by visual tracking. So part of that is about eye muscle control, but part of that is also about the brain understanding that you're going to go across and then hit the next target and then hit the next target. And so just to give you an example of how we do this neuroplasticity work, because it is one of the areas that is so unique to our program, just want to show this to you. So what's happening here is you're going to see that my son, who I should say, he's an athlete, he's a self-taught drummer, he has tremendous balance. He is looking at a pole that has a piece of paper on it with colored dots going across. And it's about 6 feet away. So he cannot use his finger to trace across that line. And what he's supposed to do is to jump on these colored squares and call out the color names in the sequence that he sees them. He does know his colors. And I just want to show you, as you watch this video, you'll see that he has quite a bit of balance checks, which would be very common for me doing this activity, but it's very unusual for him. So there's his color dots. And you can see, whoa. So this is Heather. I was just off screen. And she's noticing that the balance checks is indicating to her that he was pulling together, things were too far outside his baseline of what he can easily do without the brain looking for workarounds. So she switches to these drumsticks. And you can see he's totally fluid with this. She's taken up the word recall as well as the balance. And he's a ham, so he has to show off for you a little bit. Okay, yes. So now she adds the word recall back in. Same kid, sitting and drumming, same dots. But you can see it's appreciably harder for him. So the skill that we're looking to build up here is his visual tracking. But by taking that skill and tying it to different things that are areas of strength for him, she's allowing him to recruit skills that he has in other areas to be able to do the visual tracking process. If she were to just, throw random activities at him, it wouldn't have the same effect. She's watching very carefully for, first of all, she knows his sensory profile cold. So she's using inputs that are sensory regulating for him so that he's going to be able to embed that, utilize these strategies much more efficiently within his brain. But then additionally, she is looking for just a little bit past what he can do currently, because if she tries to make it too far outside of where he is today, his brain's going to find some other sort of a workaround, and we're not going to be building up the neural networks as we intend. So the third part of our process, as I said, is to give agency to the child, because I am not going to college with my kid, and I suspect you feel the same way about yours. I do love him. So as I said before, we got to work this equation from both sides. The second piece of giving agents, or the first component really of giving agency over to the child, is that we have to address those traumas and those fears that have built up over the years. And with that, now Dr. Mattos, if you can just give a very quick overview for folks about how having those repeated experiences of feeling unsuccessful changes the child's brain.
I think you have to realize that every failure that these children have as unexpected and as humiliating has a major blow to self-esteem. And it is experienced by some children as an existential crisis, so that they fear those situations which they expect might be dangerous. The problem with fear and danger is that it sets off our survival mechanisms, which are perfectly adaptable, except if you're not in a jungle and there's not a bear coming after you. When you have survival mode, all of your energy goes down to those parts of your body that are necessary to get the heck out of there or to fight. And it's not going to that part of the body that involves critical thinking. So as the bear is coming to you, you run or you look for a tree, but you can't turn around and say, now, bear, how about if I take the berries and you take any kind of meat that's walking around, share this forest together? It's not going to work. And he actually can't think of that. What happens when we're in survival mode is that reason is actually cut off. And you're in that situation in which, for survival purposes, you must act. So you fight, you flee. There's another part, which is freeze, which many of our children have. And that is you just stop dead. And as if you're trying to hide, and maybe they think you're dead and they won't eat you. But these are characteristics that, in fact, we have used and they're helpful to us, but not in the classroom. That is what we have to avoid. We have to allow the child to feel he's in a safe environment, that an error that he makes is not going to be an existential crisis. You have to have the child not using his limbic system only, because you can't teach calculus to a lizard. When he starts to feel safe, then he can learn how to deal with his fight-flight mechanisms. He can know when they're coming, and he can do something to avoid that and calm himself down, so he can now allow cognitive processes to be available for learning.
So there's a whole movement called the trauma-informed schools that has developed really a new approach to the classroom that takes that science as a starting point and says we start with, in order to help the child both regain and then maintain that sense of safety, it all begins with very strong connections to the caregivers or the teachers in the room. And as you'll see, we are starting with that process, but I'll show you how we're building on that as well. Because the next big thing that needs to happen in order to remove those barriers to our kids being able to access really their full analytical reasoning powers and their full potential as humans, as thought leaders, as friends, etc., is for many of them self-regulation. Now, self-regulation is a term that really, frankly, never made any sense to me, but I heard everybody talk about it when I was traveling through the land of PPTs. But eventually came to understand, in essence, it's a question of how your human organism is staying within safe tolerance ranges with respect to a number of different factors. And it turns out that hidden physiological events can actually have a similar effect on a child's state and ultimately on their brain, as is the case for trauma, like Dr. Mattis was describing. So this includes if you are if you have severe sensory processing disorder and you have an auditory trigger and there's a car horn in the parking lot, you might be taken out for the rest of the afternoon, because now your body, your brain is in complete survival mode, which, as we talked about, is not a learning mode, right? There's lots of different types of internal hidden events that can have the same effect: overheating or getting or having chronic fatigue, chronic pain. There's actually many medical issues and chronic medical conditions that also impact learning. And if this is an area that's relevant for anyone, please feel free to reach out. We'll be making available a recording of the information session that we did specifically for families whose kids do have chronic medical conditions that can have variable impacts on availability for for learning social and emotional experiences. And that is something that we address as part of a school within a school program that we're developing at Cajal, that I believe is quite possibly the first one in the world for really empowering children who do have these chronic conditions. As I said, there's multiple different systems that go into this question of what is being within regulation. But in essence, if you think about it like a control panel, we've got a safe range, that's our green here, and it relates to our immune system, to our temperature regulation, to our neurovascular, circulatory system, etc. And everybody is supposed to have safe cutoffs. But for some people, the cutoffs are set too far apart so that the body will allow itself to get up into a yellow zone or even a red zone before it takes a corrective action. And when that happens, then that will, the body is thrown into what is essentially an existential threat mode, as Dr. Mattis has helped me to understand. And then that in turn is going to generate a survivalist response because your organism is in a survival state. One of the things that we're doing that is building on the trauma-informed schools movement, as I mentioned before, is that we're taking the same concepts of helping to regain a sense of safety and then collaboratively working to identify and understand the triggers. But we're introducing into that process these understandings about the hidden neurophysiological events. And we're particularly well suited to do this because this is one of the areas where Dr. Mattis has been engaged in doing original research, as well as his colleagues. So the system that we use is we're teaching the kids to make a distinction between their trigger, their autonomic reaction. This is, for instance, this freeze, fight, flight mechanism, or the body becoming dangerously overheated, etc. And then their response. And appreciating that the response is the portion of this process that you can learn to control. So for instance, going back to that car horn in the parking lot for the child who has an auditory sensory processing trigger, when the car horn honks, the autonomic reaction is that the brain is flooded and overwhelmed and they are no longer available for learning. The response might be that they lob the book that's in their hand across the room. We don't want them to lob the book across the room, but we do need to appreciate, if we want to help them get to where that book doesn't go airborne, that there was a moment of choice that they can learn to interrupt from the reaction to the response. Now, if we give them a gold star every time they don't throw a book, that's not going to help them learn to interrupt this process. It's just going to mean that if somebody doesn't honk, they end up with a gold star, and if somebody does honk, they don't get a gold star. We're going to, over time, we're not going to do anything to neurologically prepare them to be able to regain or retain self-regulation in the face of their triggers. And we can inadvertently end up shaming them for having these differences that introduce these challenges. So that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. What nobody wants to do is to shame a child for their physical disabilities, but these are hidden events. And if you don't have that sort of specialized understanding, it can be very easy for them to be missed, and therefore for the opportunity to be missed, to help the child learn how to improve their own self-regulation. So we work as a team through very close collaboration with both across the academic side and the therapist side to build up and develop strategies that each child can use to self-monitor, self-manage, and self-advocate. And that is really something that ends up having a transformative ability to empower a child to feel that they can, again, go forward independently into a range of settings. Now, that's not going to be relevant or applicable for all of the kids in our program, but we take it as our mission that we want to develop new educational frameworks where you have the expertise in the room that you need for whatever challenge is presenting for a given child. Over time, we feel that that is the best way that we can help to support kids in a mainstream environment, is by making sure that we have frameworks in place that contain the expertise for all these different types of kids, as opposed to just being specialized for one type of diagnosis or another. So that brings us to growth mindset, which in turn brings us to agency, which you'll recall was the third major component of our program. So our agency programming is a really unique part of our program that is specifically focused on giving kids the tools that they need to optimize their own outcomes through an intellectual understanding of their needs and how that works scientifically, an authentic basis for a growth mindset, and then strategies for how they can sustainably participate in the 21st century knowledge economy, which, as I mentioned, is actually not good on human bodies. So first and foremost, we teach kids the science behind all of what we just talked about here. We're talking about neuroplasticity on day one. Why do we do this? We find that when we teach the kids the science, well, let's just start with the fact that we are pulling together a cohort of kids with very, very high analytical reasoning skills. That's their superpower. Let's use it, right? So that helps them to immediately understand, why are we, as the people doing the programming, but also we as, sort of social organisms, doing the things that we do. How does neuroplasticity work? Well, when we understand that, it helps us to understand that it's safe to believe that things can get better. And that that in turn, well, you have to appreciate these kids are like little data analytical engines, and they're looking back at all of this data and saying, don't tell me if I try, it'll get better, because I have been trying. So when you tell me that, either you're invalidating my effort that I've been putting in, or you're really just not that bright, Mom, because I know that I have tried and it hasn't improved. So when we explain to them about neuroplasticity and about how we are actually building up the neural networks that they need to be able to do it better, then that alone helps them to believe an authentic basis for a growth mindset. When we also understand the science behind why we do the things we do and why our peers do the things that they do, then it helps to present an alternative storyline to what you've heard, what they've heard in pop culture. I'm bad, or I'm stupid. Well, or alternatively, it's just science, duh, right? So that in turn helps these kids to develop compassion, and it's compassion towards themselves for the areas where they are still developing, and also compassion towards their peers who may be working through or traveling through struggles that look very different from their own. To make all this happen, we have a whole additional component to our curriculum, to our academic curriculum, which is an integrated life sciences curriculum. And this is actually one of the most powerful parts of our program at all levels, but I think specifically for the high school learners. So at the high school level, if you look at the Connecticut content standards, if you look at next generation science standards, you're going to see the high schoolers are learning a lot of science, obviously, right? Biology, anatomy, genetics, physiology, neurology, neurophysiology. How about learning that from an internationally recognized neuroscientist who can really explain how these pieces work together, and learning that from an occupational therapist who is in the process explaining to you how the motor center of your brain is communicating with the verbal processing center of your brain in order to be able to write, for instance. So what we are using within our project-based learning framework, one of the criteria that we use to select our projects and design our projects is that they will provide opportunities that are organic to that project, to provide curriculum that gives the scientific basis to understand both the challenges that the different kids in the cohort are facing, and why the strategies, the corrective strategies that we use work. We do this in a way that's not like, now we're going to talk about Johnny's differences, but rather, okay, if we understand how neurology works and we understand the range of how it works, now we start to understand how it works normatively, and then how there's this spectrum of reality. And now, as we're helping a given child to understand their own profile, they're able to slot themselves into a spectrum of human experience. That alone is powerful. But this goes a lot further than that, because it means that it supports those personalized strategies, because the child and their ability to self-regulate in what become adaptable, sustainable skills that they can take setting to setting. So now, by understanding the science, I'm able to understand what are my specialized strengths and needs, both my strengths and my weaknesses. How and why do my strategies work? When I understand why my strategies work, I am positioned as I'm continuing to mature and I get to start to have, let's say, new triggers, or for kids who have chronic medical conditions, maybe a new symptom. Well, now I have an intellectual framework that I can use that has been modeled for me over and over again for how do I start to break that down and say, okay, well, what science have I got available to me? How can I develop a strategy that is going to help me to move forward? And then ultimately, how am I going to advocate for my needs? Because again, going back to like, Google or Apple or any of the major tech giants, if you walk in their offices, they do not look like our classrooms. That is not how they are set up. It is not rigid chairs and rigid desks. It is sit stand desks. It is physio gyms. It is treadmills. It is a track around the outside where you can have a walk with a colleague while you collaborate on developing a new solution. It's time for our schools to start to look like our professional environments do, so that we can use our schools to model and give the kids knowledge of how do I monitor my whole self within this environment. I can't think of a group of kids for whom that will be more valuable and important than at the high school level. So in the high school years, obviously, they're going through tremendous amounts of change within their own bodies. We are all right now going through tremendous amounts of change within our social organizing. And this is an opportunity for us to be modeling for them. No, you don't stay up till 4 o'clock in the morning cramming, because that isn't good for your body and you're not going to be at your best the next day or the day after. No, we don't just sit hunched over the desk. We have to build up some postural support muscles, or else by the time you're graduating from college, you're going to have such back pain that it's going to limit your professional abilities. So we're not used to thinking of that as part of a core school curriculum, but it is an essential part of preparing kids to be sustainable participants in our knowledge economy, as I keep saying. So how do we do that? Our high school classroom, each of the classrooms at Cajal Academy is designed and set up to facilitate a different type of learning. So for the younger learners, that includes a lot of embodied learning through things like obstacle courses, etc. For the high school learners, that includes things such as understanding, how do I figure out if I have an ergonomic work setup right now? And how do I figure out when I need to take breaks to stand or breaks to sit, so that I can optimize my availability to keep learning as long as possible. PT taught phys ed classes and also fitness programs, so that each of the kids will walk out of Cajal knowing, the way that I actually need to optimize my own personal performance as a thinker as much as an athlete is this is the right fitness program for me to be doing every week. And then also coaching and how to use physio techniques to regulate the mind and the body and the mood. And that comes out of those neurophysio insights and connections that we talked about earlier. And then finally, just the very fact of it being normatively part of our environment at Cajal to discuss self-monitoring and self-care, that right there is very powerful in helping children to prioritize that for themselves as they go forward. Because I strongly suspect that the majority of the adults watching this video or on our call here today have some level of back pain or neck pain, or your eyesight is going from squinting too long at the screen, or there are things that happen, and we want to make sure that we give our kids the information that they need to be able to make informed choices. So the last component of our programming and our agency programming is this very specific focus on developing a growth mindset. As I mentioned before, teaching the kids the science behind the program and behind their own needs really generates an authentic basis for having a growth mindset by helping the children to understand that it's reasonable to think that things will get better. But what happens when we understand the concept, or really the meaning of a growth mindset as a whole, is that we automatically are able to go further, farther, faster, simply because we believe that we eventually will be able to do so. So this comes out of the research of a neuropsychologist named by Carol Dweck, who identified that if you go to two classrooms on the first day of school and they're side by side, and then the first classroom, you walk in, you introduce yourself, and you say, for this entire school year, every time you realize you can't do something, I want you to say, I can't do it yet. And then you go next door and you just say hi, but you don't introduce them. You don't introduce this concept to them. Then what ends up happening is that the classroom where you say you introduce this concept of yet ends up at the end of the school year having measurably higher standardized test scores. Now that's remarkable. So we integrate into our school day a flexible system we devised called the YETS, where the kids are actually doing a self-assessment towards the individual skills that together add up to a growth mindset and their personalized strategies. Last thing I wanted to mention is that there's a lot of flexibility that we have designed into our program. And this is where it frankly comes as a benefit that we had just started to launch our school 2 months before COVID hit. Because it means that we are not retrofitting our program for the kinds of flexibility that this past year has demanded, but rather that has been part of our design principles. So for families who find that wherever COVID may take us as we go down the line, as I said, we're currently in discussions with facilities that would allow us to open in person, and we're very eager and excited to get back to that. However, we appreciate that with the uncertainty around what's going to happen with vaccines, et cetera, there may still be learners who, for their own or for their family's health reasons, need to stay remote. And so we just want to assure you that that is something that we will continue to support even after the program returns to an in-person environment. And I think, again, that's particularly relevant for our high school group because this is an age where you're old enough to be having appreciable reactions to COVID. And we appreciate that there may be some people for whom the vaccine is not as effective. Our remote program is synchronous. It is active learning. And the therapeutic expertise that we've been talking about here today is all integrated within it. Our kids participate in small group classes. It is still discussion-based teaching. It is not worksheets. It is not review packets. It is socially engaged learning. We just devise projects that have a greater, that are more flexible for doing them virtually or digitally rather than in person. We also have a community-wide portal, which we launched this year and we will continue to utilize next year as well after we go back in person, which is an intranet specifically just for Cajal Academy. So this has really helped to, frankly, to increase communication between home and school. And also it has chat functionality within it that the kids can use to collaborate with each other. Each of the different classes has a private group where they can share their work with each other, share silly memes, etc. And each family has their own group that they can use where all of the child's teachers and therapists will also be a member of each family's group, so that you can pose questions or give feedback on, well, gee, so-and-so came home super, super cranky today. Can someone help me understand what's going on? Whatever it may be. So we have that as well. And then additionally, as part of our effort to pull the community together, we have just launched our first of what we anticipate will be a series of community educational workshops where we're sharing more of the science behind the program and our different approaches. There are some people who are curious about tuition, and I can appreciate that. Cajal Academy is a special education school, and as you can probably guess, special education programming of the sort that we've just described is not the cheapest to provide. We are priced equivalent to other special education schools in the community, but we integrate into our program directly the direct services with licensed therapists, including OT, PT, and psychological counseling with Dr. Mattis. And we are also looking to bring an SLP into our team for the fall. So for many families, that eliminates a substantial family budget item with respect to community-based therapists, because the folks that we have on our uh, team on the therapeutic side, they are literally therapists to whom school districts go for IEEs. And so they do have that level of expertise, and the medical level of expertise with respect to remediating various different challenges. So the tuition for the year, the base tuition, is currently set for the coming year at $65,000. The For students who need a substantial amount of additional therapeutic work, particularly one-to-one work, whether it's to address a specific learning disability or a specific, for instance, additional social emotional counseling with Dr. Mattis. We are a tuition-based nonprofit, so we need to be mindful of making sure that we stay sustainable for the whole community and all committed families. However, so for that reason, there may be an additional supplemental fee to make sure that we can fully support the child's needs within the budget of the program. For folks who are interested in applying, we would love to hear from you. We are making our admissions decisions on a rolling basis. And as I said, we have quite a limited number of positions for the fall, which we will be growing over the course of the year and in the subsequent years. But to be part of this initial, very special exclusive cohort, we're going to be, those slots are going to be filling up on a rolling basis. You can access our application on our website. And just click on the apply tab, and then that will take you right to where you need to go. And as part of that application, we ask that you upload all of the existing evaluations that you have in your child, and that we really, our clinicians, read through that very carefully. We're looking for additional areas of leverage that might have been overlooked in other programming environments, to help to really help to move a child forward. So with that, that is the entirety of our very long spiel here today. Tech problems, puppy dogs and all. So I will, with that, I'm going to stop our recording, and so that we can open it up if anybody wants to stick around and ask questions. Dr. Mattis and I are happy to stick around and answer them. And again, thank you very much for spending time to watch this open house, and please let us know if you have any questions.